So good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending this talk. I'm Jessica Colnago, and I'm going to be presenting our paper in which we explore the ability of different privacy scales to capture and distinguish granular privacy constructs. So before I start, I want to clarify what we mean by privacy scales. So privacy scales use multiple statements to capture respondents' views on privacy. And generally speaking, scales are very thoroughly validated when they're developed and have consistent results over time. An example of a very common privacy scale that is used in the privacy literature is the Internet Users Information Privacy Concern Scale. Normally you just say IAPP because it's a mouthful, which is intended to capture privacy concern across multiple subdomains. A valid privacy scale can offer really useful insights into public perspective on privacy, but a scale that is not valid, that is, like a scale that fails to measure what is intended to measure, presents a challenge for privacy research because it will yield results that cannot sustain accurate generalizations or that lack predictive power. And past work has also identified some issues with regard to the framing of a scale, both at the statement level and at the scale level. And there's also been more recent work that's challenged the validity of existing scales. And this last issue is pretty damning and confusing because for you to propose a new scale, you need to show strong validity in multiple areas, like internal validity, construct validity, et cetera. So just to contextualize why this is a problem, let me paint a familiar picture to most of you. Let's imagine someone answered the 10-item IAPP scale, and they come back as someone with high levels of privacy concern on all of its 3 subscales. We then go talk to this person about what they do with regards to their information privacy, and we see that they're like an avid social media user, posting a lot of things about themselves online, and they have all sorts of smart devices in their home. Oops. So this lack of consistency between expressed attitudes and preferences and their actual behavior would seem like a classical example of the privacy paradox. But what if it isn't? So when we've investigated the privacy paradox in the past, we've often focused on the participant to try to understand this mismatch. Maybe they didn't express themselves correctly, maybe they didn't understand how much of their privacy they were giving up by engaging in these behaviors, which are all very valid and real reasons, right? Privacy is complicated, it's an evolving concept. We as scholars don't all agree on what it means. There are psychological theories that can explain that how people will arrive at 2 very different ways of thinking about the same issue. And we also know that information asymmetry and cognitive biases are a really big problem when it comes to privacy. But what if we focus on our tools instead? Right? It could be an issue of context, since our existing privacy scales were meant for a very specific context, like information privacy in a corporate setting for CFIP. And maybe they just don't generalize well to other contexts. It could also be that our privacy scales just aren't working the way that we think they should. And in this work, we focus on understanding how well statements used in existing privacy scales capture the constructs that they are meant to capture. In particular, we're looking to better understand how well existing privacy scales capture and distinguish between different privacy constructs. And we also wanted to identify whether we can create statements that are better suited to capture specific ones. To achieve these goals, we took 3 steps. The first one is that we needed to select which constructs we were going to focus on. And to do this, we leveraged existing findings in the literature, and we started from a set of constructs and definitions that Schaub and Cranor proposed in a chapter for the IAPP book called Usable and Useful Privacy Interfaces. Then we had to go about finding good definitions for them because this is something that's actually missing in the literature. So we started from definitions that are close to what was proposed by Schaub and Cranor, and then we collected feedback from 23 privacy experts on the definitions, and we used their agreements and disagreements to revise the definitions in an iterative way. Once we had what we considered to be consistent and a stable set of definitions, we moved on to collect data to identify which constructs are related to different statements. For our study, we focus on statements from CFIP, so Concern for Information Privacy, GIPC, Global Information Privacy Concern, the Western Segmentation Index, IAPP, I'm not going to say that again, and some statements that we generated ourselves. Given the presentation duration, I'm going to focus only on the methodology and results for step 3. You can refer to the paper, you can come talk to me about steps 1 and 2. So to do the classification survey, we recruited participants using Prolific's representative sample for US participants. And we had 400 participants such that each statement was seen by at least 40 people. We showed participants the definitions and some brief instructions, followed by 7 randomly selected blocks where we asked participants to imagine they were talking to a friend and that their friend said one of the statements that we were investigating. Then we asked participants to select how well each construct described what they thought their friend is trying to communicate by saying that statement. So to start our analysis, we first wanted to know if the statements were uniquely described by a single construct. And we started looking at this by grouping, binning participant responses into high and low scores. We checked the robustness of our grouping approach by combining the neutral option both in the high and the low, and there wasn't really a difference. And then for each statement, we determined whether there was a primary construct by looking on a per statement basis at the 2 constructs that had the highest count of high scores. And we compared the counts of high and low scores using chi-square tests and Kramer's V to determine whether the top construct was statistically different from the second highest construct and how big of an effect size it was. So the results of this analysis indicated that the majority of statements were not described by a single primary construct, and even that those that did have a primary construct often had small effect sizes. And this clear mapping between statement and construct can be explained by the statements not having been construed in a sufficient clear way, but also it could be that the constructs we're investigating may not be easily separable. And there's actually backing from the linguistics side of things to support evidence too. So we wanted to investigate the seemingly more complex relationship between the constructs and the statements, and to do that, we use non-negative matrix factorization. I can't get into details on the method, even though I want to, so come talk to me afterwards if you have questions or read the paper. But the intuition behind this method is that you can go from a high-dimensional space, in this case, our 6 constructs, you can extract some usable features from it, you identify a reduced space of what we are calling meta-constructs that are composed by the original 6 constructs in different amounts. And then it also identifies how these meta-constructs relates to the original data points. And it essentially does this by decomposing the original data matrix into 2 matrices. So essentially, we went from like 6 constructs to 5 meta-constructs, so it's not a huge reduction. And I wanted to highlight that while we did name them based on the constructs that were more significant when composing, that compose each meta-construct, they aren't perfectly independent. For example, if you look at the concern meta-construct, while it is composed primarily of concern, it also has some attitude aspects to it, and to a lesser degree, preference, decision, and behavior. So with these meta-constructs in hand, we could then examine the different statements based on their meta-construct composition. In the paper, we present the composition using a heat map visualization where darker colors mean that the meta-construct is more predominant. And this is pretty much impossible to read slide. You have the heat maps for the statements that had attitude as a more predominant meta-construct on the left. And on the right, you have the heat maps for the statements that had the decision plus behavior meta-construct on the right. Yes. So by analyzing the results we got from NMF, we found that, again, very few statements had only one meta-construct. For example, while I believe other people are too much concerned with online privacy issues seems to be more predominantly composed by the attitude meta-construct, I feel that society worries too much about privacy is pretty clearly split between concern and attitude. And when we looked at our results on a per scale level, we see that the scales we investigated frequently had statements that capture a combination of preference and concern. Something that I think was interesting was that even the statements that we generated specifically for these constructs seemed to, while they fare a little bit better, like they had like an 85% match with the construct that we originally intended them to capture, we still see that most statements are really a composition of different meta-constructs. So all these results do paint a little bit of a bleak picture about our ability to distinguish between commonly used privacy constructs. We still wanted to understand what we can do to better create statements, since scales are really useful tool, right? And we want to be able to use them. So to do this, we collaborated with Dr. Kate Jane, a professor of linguistics at the University of Pittsburgh, who helped us conduct a corpus analysis based on the NMF categorization, which identified some coarse-grained irregularities in the kinds of words found in the statements that were robustly associated with a primary construct. And these regularities may be exploited in future prompt construction. So, for example, from our analysis, we had some categories of words that were more likely to be associated with the statement. We had verb signaling desire and modal signaling desired outcomes being more commonly associated with privacy preferences, which kind of makes sense intuitively, whereas expressions signaling negative perceptions were more frequently associated with privacy concern. On the paper, you have a table in the appendix that has all of the categories broken down very individually. And as you can see in the slide, we have a few key ways to keep statements better, right? We want to have them be short, because then you limit the features that may be connected to multiple constructs. And right now, a lot of the scales have pretty long statements. You want, which is kind of confusing, but you also want them to be descriptive. So they need to be short and descriptive to reduce the amount of background information that the reader will fill in themselves. If you leave things to be vague or that can have multiple interpretations, the interpretation of the statement will be heavily influenced by people's background information. And you also want it to be focused so that you can reduce the range of interpretation that any one reader might have of that statement. So our takeaways are essentially that existing scales frequently don't have statements that capture only the constructs they were designed to capture. Though with careful consideration, it may be possible to create better statements, and that privacy-related constructs are really intertwined. And if your work requires you to clearly distinguish between them, for example, you clearly need to separate preferences from concerns, you need to do that with extreme care, and you might need to evaluate whether statements and scales are the best tool to do that. I'm happy to take any of your questions and also happy to talk about it afterwards.